In this problem set, we'll be working with percents, fractions, and decimals. So looking at our first example, we have 115%, and we want to turn this into its decimal and its fraction. Let's first start by turning this into its decimal. Well, we know that 115% can be turned into a decimal by dividing by 100. But instead of dividing by 100, we can also just move the decimal 2 places over to the left. So let's start this by first writing 115, and our decimal is going to be right after our 5. But now when we divide by 100, we're just going to move the decimal 2 places to the left, so it's right in between these two ones. So that means 150% as a decimal is 1.15. Now we have to turn 150% into a fraction. Well, again, we know that percent is divide by 100. So the fraction is going to be 115 divided by 100. But as we can see, this is an improper fraction, so we want to change it into its mixed number. First, we see how many times does 100 go into 115? Well, it goes in once, and then how much is left over? Well, if 100 goes into 115 once, that means we're going to have 15 left over. So 15 is going to be our numerator, and then 100 is our denominator. Now, 15 over 100 can be reduced down if we divide the top and bottom by 5. So now we get 1 and 3/20 as our fraction. So 1.15 is our decimal, and 1 and 3/20 is our fraction. Moving on to our next example, we want to change 2.75 into its percent and its fraction. So let's first start by turning 2.75 into its percent. Well, instead of starting with a percent, we're starting with a decimal. So instead of moving the decimal to the left, we're going to move it to the right. So when we have 2.75, we want to move the decimal 2 places to the right. So now our percent is going to be 275, and then we have to add our percent sign. Now we're going to take this percent and use it to find our fraction. Because we know percent is divided by 100, we're going to take 275 and divide it by 100. Again, this is an improper fraction, so we can turn this into its mixed number. We first see how many times does 100 go into 275. 100 can go into 275 twice, so that's our whole number out front. And then how much do we have left over? Well, 2 times 100 is 200, and 275 minus 200 is 75. So we have 75 over 100 as our fraction beside it. But again, this 75 and 100 can be reduced down if we divide the top and bottom by 25. So now we have 2 and 3/4 as our fraction. So 2.75 as a percent is 275%, and 2.75 as a fraction is 2 and 3/4. Now we can see that this makes sense because 2 and 3/4, well, 2 is our whole number in our decimal, well, 3/4 as a decimal is 0.75. So that's why it makes sense to be our decimal in 2.75. Now let's move on to our next example. We have 2 and 1/2. Well, we want to turn this fraction into its percent and its decimal. Let's first start off by turning it into its percent. First, we have to get this mixed number into its improper fraction. So how do we do that? We take the denominator, multiply it by the whole number out front, and then add on the numerator. So we have 2 times 2 gives us 4, and 4 plus 1 is 5. So 5 is our new numerator, and then we're over the same denominator of 2. Now that we have an improper fraction, we want to turn this improper fraction to have a denominator of 100. So what do we have to multiply by 2 to get 100? Well, 2 times 50 gives us 100, so we multiply the bottom by 2, and then we multiply the top by 2. 5 times 50 gives us 250, and 2 times 50 gives us 100. So now we have 250 over 100, which means our percent is 250%. Now we want to turn 2 and 1/2 into a decimal. Well, we're going to use our percent to do this. So again, when we have our percent and we want to go to a decimal, we just take the decimal and move it 2 spaces to the left. So we have 250 with our decimal right here, and we're going to move it 2 spaces to the left. So now our decimal is right between this 2 and 5. So we have 2.5, and we can add the 0 at the end if we want, or we can just leave it like this. So 2 and 1/2 as a percent is 250%, and as a decimal is 2.5. Now let's move to our example up here where we have 10 and 4/5. Again, we want to change this into its percent and its decimal. So we want to take this mixed number and turn it into its improper fraction. To do this, we're going to take our denominator, multiply it by the whole number out front, and then add on our numerator. So we have 5 times 10, which gives us 50, and 50 plus 4 is 54. And then our denominator stays the same as 5. But now we want to turn this denominator to be a denominator of 100. So what do we have to multiply by 5 to give us 100? Well, 5 times 20 is 100, so we multiply the bottom and the top by 20. 54 times 20 is 1080, and 5 times 20 is 100. So now we have 1080 over 100, and to turn this into a percent, we just take our numerator. So 10 and 4/5 is 1080%. Now we want to turn this into a decimal. So we're going to use our percent to do this. Remember, when we want to go from percent to decimal, we move our decimal 2 spaces to the left. So we have 1080, our decimal right here, and we're going to move it 2 spaces to the left to be right in between this 0 and 8. So now 10 and 4/5 as a decimal is 10.8. So we have our percent of 1080%, and our decimal is 10.8. Moving on to our final example, we have 5.65. We want to change this decimal into its percent and its fraction. Let's first start off by changing this into its percent. Well, in this case, we have a decimal and we want to move it into its percent. So we're going to take our decimal and move it 2 spaces to the right. So we have 5.65, and we're going to move our decimal 2 spots to the right and add it right after the 5. So now our percent is 565%. After we moved our decimal 2 spaces to the right. Now we want to turn 5.65 into its fraction. Well, to do this, we're going to take our percent, and because percent is over 100, we're going to turn it into a fraction of 565 over 100. Now this is an improper fraction, so let's turn it into a mixed number. We know that 100 can go into 565 5 times, so that's our whole number out front, and then we have to find out how much is left over. Well, 5 times 100 is 500, and 565 minus 500 leaves us with 65. So 65 is left over, and that's our numerator, and our denominator stays the same at 100. But we can reduce down 65 over 100 if we divide the top and bottom by 5. So now we're left with 5 and a fraction of 13 over 20. So 5.65 as a percent is 565%, and 5.65 as a fraction is 5 and 13 over 20.